my name is Ravjot Singh. I'm a Sikh filmmaker and art activist. I'm glad to be part of this discussion on World Channel about the Crossroads documentary. I often say that Sikhs are a minority of a minority. We're a religious minority even in our home country of India, and out here in the United States, we are certainly an even smaller minority. And this is why discussions like these are so important, because we need more Sikh representatives to speak up and share our experiences and be heard in a world where our voices are drowned out no matter where we are in the diaspora. Media and representation carries so much weight when it comes to modern day politics and issues. We live in an era where social media and art has created lasting movements which ignite change. And as a Sikh filmmaker, that's my goal, to bring that attention to our small but strong population and educate others about who we are as Sikhs, especially in the US, where sentiments against Sikhs, Muslims, and other brown people became fueled with hate and misinformation after 9/11. That's why Crossroads is an incredibly important film for so many reasons, especially how it highlights the Sikh community of Indianapolis. And during this conversation, we'll hear from the filmmaker about the making of our film, as well as Sikh thought leaders about how this story had a tremendous impact on the Sikh community. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining. And this is meant to be an open, fluid discussion. So please feel free to add your own experiences and thoughts to absolutely any question. Everyone's welcome to answer any question. Awesome to have you all. So many incredible thought leaders for the South Asian Sikh community on one panel. It's going to be wonderful. So I'm going to start off with the filmmaker herself. So I just wanted to kind of get a scope for, especially for folks who don't know or haven't watched the film yet. Sarita, would you mind telling us what is Crossroads?
So Crossroads is a short documentary about the FedEx mass shooting that took place last April 21, in Indianapolis, at one of the largest FedEx warehouses in the country. There were 8 victims in the shooting, 4 of whom were Sikhs. And, one of the most, so the film is about not just the shooting, but what the Sikh community experienced after the shooting.
Right, and I think that was conveyed beautifully in the film as well. And there is, talk actually of a red flag law. Amrit, I wanted to ask you, what is the red flag law? Can you kind of, give a summary of it for folks who don't know and how that relates to this case?
Yeah, so red flag laws in general are laws, or state level laws that allow law enforcement agencies to essentially flag somebody who is potentially a harm or a threat to themselves or to others based on violent, conduct or significant mental health issues that might result in violence or harm to themselves or others. And those are people who, based on legitimate evidence, including having possession of weapons and having access to instigating such harm, are brought before the prosecutor's office, who then brings them before the court and a judge who makes a determination on whether these people should be allowed access or prohibited access from having firearms and those types of weapons.
Absolutely. I think, Nav, you have incredible insight into, also being a Sikh man who's living in post 9/11 America. I mean, I just want to hear your experiences and, how the, gaze or bias has shifted after that incident. We've talked about it a little bit before in our previous talks too, but I think that would be incredibly valuable perspective and story.
Yeah, sure. So for context, I was 9 years old when 9/11 happened. So I grew up in a post 9/11 world. I went to school with classmates who then started looking at me differently, calling me different names. And these are kids, 10 years old, 12-year-olds, that are being fed this hate, this ignorance, and this bias, and then expressing it towards other children. And I think that's always been my biggest concern, is that we as in like society has allowed that ignorance to permeate all the way to children, who then grow up with this bias inside of them.
One thing I heard that kind of stood out to me was, you feel comfortable in your identity now, which is amazing. And we've talked about this before, but it's still so difficult to maintain it. And a lot of folks, a lot of our own, Sikh men in particular, I feel they often shed that identity. They often shed, the dadi, which is a beard, and the pag, which is a turban, to kind of assimilate, to kind of fit in, to avoid being targets of hate crimes. So it's just, I can definitely speak to that as well. I've grown up being called Osama's daughter as the primary nickname at school. So, I trust that we've all heard it all on this panel. Ashmita, I mean, you work for an amazing channel that kind of helps bring that representation forward, and y'all are in New York City, and I know you travel around the United States. I know you guys do an amazing job kind of, being out there on the field and bringing that representation forward. How do you think that representation being more inclusive in mainstream media especially could help the Western perspective on Sikhs?
Once again, thank you for, including the representation aspect in this conversation. I think when we talk about hate, it's really easy to look at the individual who is the culprit behind any action, whether it's a mass shooter, whether it's a town that has certain tendencies and they're passing laws, a state, but really it's a cultural thing, right? And the media and works of art, production, content, the kind of work that Sarita does as a filmmaker, you do, Ravjot, through various art installations, as well as your films, and the work that we do as traditional media, they kind of drive the narrative of how folks think about people. And, there are certain parallels, and I'll hit them really quickly.
Absolutely. And I've actually heard you talk about this before, Ash, but I think, the same question applies to Sarita and Nav as well. I think one of the issues that Punjabi media has with itself is kind of, catering to itself. And I think a lot of ethnic media does this, where they end up just kind of, they definitely do spread their messages, but it ends up not hitting the right audience. The audience that we want to be hitting is, the Western audiences that wouldn't otherwise turn on channels like ours. So, I'm wondering what your take is on how to really, infiltrate and get our word out there to the right audience, to the right Western audience, instead of just, circling it around in our own communities.
Well, I mean, I know this is not the nicest thing to say, but the first thing is we have to get out of our own way, right? And it's like you said, sometimes we think that, if other Punjabis, other Sikhs, other Indians are watching us and listening to us, then the work is done and we, don't have to bother about anybody else. And that, I think, is the first mistake. But, I think there's a whole generation of us that don't feel that way and certainly don't conduct ourselves in our professional capacity in that way. But once we, start getting that time, that attention span of folks outside of our community, I think it's really important to not just talk about the things that matter to us as a community, kind of our wants and needs, but to talk about things where it's about, the country or the system that we live in.
Our Sikh community has been underserved for such a long time, especially after 9/11, as we all agree. So we could definitely share our stories, and we will continue to, and I hope to continue to hear, resolutions come out of this situation. But from what it sounds like there's a lot of grieving that's still happening. There's still a lot of unanswered questions. I mean, Sarita, you've done an amazing job with the documentary, with Crossroads calling attention to this shooting and to gun violence in general, and kind of helping, connect to a larger audience with that broad messaging. I mean, what is the call to action? And, with that, we'll head towards wrapping this wonderful panel up. Each of us are such warriors in our real life. I think we have to be, as Sikh Americans, and each of us are doing such a wonderful job at continuing to kind of integrate our culture without letting it go, and bring it to mainstream media. So honestly, thank you very much for such a wonderful conversation. And Evelyn, I'll send it off to you.